Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe. Follow us, likes, double tap. Now they control your life.
What is going on, beautiful people? Welcome back to the 817 podcast, where we talk about the lovely city of Fort Worth, Texas. We dive into Tarrant County, state politics, business trends, culture. As a busy Fort Worthian looking to get a quick synopsis of what's going on, that is what we're here for at the 817 podcast. We do 3 short stories, 1 big story, and wins and losses for the city of Fort Worth. We've been doing this for a hot minute, and man, we've been on a roll with a lot of different interviews, and we have a special guest today, and that is Jim Riddlesperger, and really excited to have him. And how goes it?
It goes very well today. I was excited to have Jim on the pod. He's a friend and a neighbor, and I've known him for years, so I was excited that he accepted our invitation to come and talk about things, and I feel like going back to college just because he has so much knowledge to impart, and not that I really want to go back to college, but I would enjoy sitting through some of those classes. Yeah,
100%. And I also heard that you were at a coffee shop and someone recognized you by your voice.
Yes, it was the strangest thing. I was at Black Coffee on Friday, and I was talking to someone that I knew, and there was somebody standing at the bar getting ready to order their coffee, and they had their back to me, and they turned around real quick when they heard me talking, and they were like, "Are you Ann?" And I was like, yes. And he said, I would recognize that voice anywhere from the pod. I listened to y'all on the pod. So that's was my
awesome.
First voice recognition.
I love it. And, you know, I this pod is fun because there's just some really passionate, influential local people who rock with us. And I just think you guys are all doing amazing work. And that the fact that we could be an hour of your week as you do what you do in the city, that means a lot. I've heard people say, hey, you know, I don't have subscriptions to newspapers because of financial situations or time. And so just to be able to sit with you guys for 45 minutes and get what I need and then get, you know, strategic perspectives because of our experiences, and then getting guests like Jim on, it's just been really cool. And then Commissioner Simmons was dynamic as well last week. I mean, she really brought in all the things we need to know, and hopefully that activates more of us for county politics.
Hopefully people will come away with doing the next steps, which, you know, as frustrating and discouraged as people might be sometimes with the news, I think it gets people to become more civically engaged. Yeah,
because we actually have an election. I don't know if you've voted yet. I voted already in this May 4th election.
I did as well.
Come on now, look at us. And you guys, I guess we'll still have time because you have this week.
I think there's some early voting today still. Through 4 o'clock. Well, today is Sunday, and so sorry.
But the 30th as well. There will be opens as well, and we'll just put that in the show notes as well, so you can have the information, which is hard to find because I was trying to find locations, and there's no locations in the 76103 zip code at all.
There's none like really close to me either. I used to be able to go to Pascal High School or to McLean 6th grade, which I can walk to from my house, and neither of those are in this this cycle. So I went to the other side of 35 to the community center, Worth Heights Community Center.
Yeah. So make sure you guys go out and do that. So let's go ahead and dive into our 3 short stories. And if you're wondering why county politics is important, we're going to be talking about a lot of important things to also get you aware of what's going on.
So our first story is a Fort Worth Star-Telegram article entitled "Tarrant County DA Appeals Ruling That Overturned Crystal Mason's Illegal Voting Conviction." So we've talked quite a bit about the elections integrity unit that Tarrant County has stood up because they believe that this is such a crucial issue. But in this case, this was a conviction that was overturned, and now we see that our Tarrant County District Attorney's Office is asking an appellate court to reverse the ruling that overturned this conviction of illegal voting. The Texas Second Court of Appeals on March 28th found Mason's 2018 conviction should be overturned because she didn't have actual knowledge that she couldn't vote while on federal supervised release in a tax fraud case. She was convicted of voting in March 2018 in a bench trial, and that verdict, according to the district attorney's office, he thinks it should be affirmed. So they did a Thursday news release announcing the case's appeal and the state's highest criminal appellate court. And a copy of that wasn't immediately available on the county's website. I don't know what I think about this. I'm like, it just seems like nonsense.
It goes back to what Commissioner Simmons said with we're paying six figures for an election integrity lawyer. They have no real wins. There's no real findings. They're spending all this energy. And Crystal Mason has been the poster child for this narrative that who knows what propaganda emails and newsletters are being sent out with her face on it, with all this election stuff. And I feel bad for her for that. And for real, like, they're saying that she was unaware. Like, why would someone be aware that they can't vote because they're on some type of probation? Like, one, that's kind of crazy because that should be the story of the topic. Should people who have situations still have the right to vote?
Yeah, after they've served their time and all of that. And it says in this article that she cast a provisional ballot in 2016 while on supervised release. The vote was never counted, and she was later found guilty of voting illegal and sentenced to 5 years in prison. This is flabbergasting to me that this is what we're spending our time.
Yeah, and it's just, the people who are involved in the judicial system or having an arrest or being in prison should have the right to vote. Just because a mistake that have you behind bars, if you're allowed to go get a college degree to get your life going civically, you're already there, gives you motivated to like learn about your community politics. They have libraries and resources. These people have a voice, and their voice is important because a lot of our local dollars go to their existence, which we're going to talk about in story number 3.
Yeah, and one would think that you would want people to improve themselves and come out better and then wanting to be contributing members of society.
Yeah.
And if we just continue to not allow them to do that, then I think we're damaging ourselves.
Yeah. So we just an example of this election integrity and being just a big wash, and our Tarrant County DA's office just being wasteful of what actually matters. And so we just wanted to highlight that because we also talked a little bit about this on our interview with Commissioner Simmons. Let's go ahead and move into short story number 2. Tarrant County will receive part of a $250 million federal grant to expand solar energy. Millions in federal solar funds could flow into Tarrant County following an Environmental Protection Agency grant announced Monday. A coalition of urban Texas cities and counties, including Tarrant, will receive about $250 million to provide solar energy to low-income and disadvantaged communities across the state. Tarrant joined Harris County, Dallas County, Travis County, the city of San Antonio, and a group of border counties in their application last year. The Solar for All program awarded $7 billion to 60 applicants across the country, including $150 million to another Texas-based group working with universities, primarily serving minority students. About 900,000 households nationwide will save over $350 million on their electric bills as a result of this investment. Tarrant County nearly didn't apply for federal funds, and I remember us talking about this on the pod after Republican county commissioners voted against joining the coalition in July. We didn't get to talk to Commissioner Simmons about this, but she was very proactive in making this work. This was one of her wins, and it just shows you how powerful when you actually have someone who's being productive in county office. She's done so much, and this is one of the things, creating a climate task force, kind of a committee to be able to look at these kind of things. And without her, we could have been missed on this opportunity. And I think the O'Hare kind of camp was all about a lot of this stuff is exploitative and taking advantage of our communities and actually not being very helpful.
Yeah, I think that it's very much a situation which we kind of talked to our guest today about, where partisan politics are ascribed to things that should never be considered partisan. We almost lost out on some of this funding based on a narrative that is very prevalent out there, that there are unscrupulous solar companies saddling people with solar panels that then, hurt their ability to sell their homes and that sort of thing. And I think that is very much a right-wing narrative that has been out there. And so they ascribe that to solar in general, and then they're anti-solar because solar is considered to be, a liberal thing, I guess. So I think that just is another example of where I think this is a clear example of where Commissioner Simmons did her research and acknowledged the fact that there are times when those kind of things do happen, when unscrupulous people sell people who don't know the full details of what they're signing on to and are damaged in that way. But I don't think it's a reason to just shut down every opportunity and not be a part of. And so I think this is an example of Commissioner Simmons doing her due diligence and convincing the other commissioners, well, at least a majority of them, to not lose out on this. But I think we did lose out. We're not considered in the full package, is my understanding. So we may not be getting as much funding as we would have had we been in the part of the group in the beginning of looking at these awards and the amount of funding that could have come to Tarrant County.
Yeah, and what people forget is that Texas is a leader in electrification from renewable energies like solar and wind, and so much of our state's grid is because of these things. We are still leading in oil and fossil fuels, but we're also leading in this space, and that should be something that's celebrated rather than villainized. And that's just kind of the name of the game. So let's go ahead and move into short story number 3. Short story number 3 is a group of stories basically around Sheriff Wayborn and the deaths at Tarrant County jails. We've had 2 recently, and so it's just something that we feel like we need to bring up, continue to talk about. So, Ann, can you bring us into the first story?
So the first story is a NBC5 story that indicates that Tarrant County Sheriff responds to ongoing concerns over most recent jail deaths. 60-plus inmates have died since 2017, which is the tenure of the current sheriff. He's responded to these ongoing concerns about these inmate deaths at Tarrant County Jail. So currently there's investigations underway determining the cause of the latest deaths in the Tarrant County Jail, but Sheriff Wayborn has asked the community to be patient, indicating that they need time to see whatever the truth is. And again, if people need to be held criminally responsible, they will. Unfortunately, on Sunday, a 31-year-old died while being held at the Tarrant County Jail in an incident where he was pepper sprayed. We have a couple of other articles that get into the specifics of the 2 most recent deaths.
Yeah, and the first one on there was the inmate was found dead early Thursday morning following an apparent medical emergency. This was around 5:30 a.m. Medical personnel from JPS Hospital immediately responded to the jail and began life-saving measures. MedStar and Fort Worth Fire Department also responded, and the inmate was pronounced dead. The inmate identified as a 42-year-old Roderick Johnson of Fort Worth, and he was arrested by Fort Worth police on charge of unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon and deadly contact. Ruling on the matter and the cause of his death are pending in an autopsy. So this happened on Thursday, and this led to, we didn't really talk about it much. We brought it up on Commissioner Simmons' interview, but then literally the next week, now you have someone who the current situation is pepper spray, and post the pepper spray situation has now been, is dead because of that. That's just a heartbreaking, because that one is also, his family mentions that they were seeking mental health services for him, and as that he was a Marine or part of the military in some capacity, and he had schizophrenia. And so this is the part of, like, you hear Sheriff Wayborn in the county saying we are the mental health service provider of Tarrant County, and that's a problem, because clearly you're not doing what's necessary, and your rate of deaths on your tenure is double that of the person before you.
Yeah, and I think that when they say that they are the mental health provider, they should be the mental health provider in the medical facilities that they fund,
Yeah.
which is like JPS Hospital.
Yeah.
They should not be trying to provide those mental health services in the jails, which is what it seems to be is happening. And in this instance, it's so heartbreaking because it appears that they tried to get mental health services before incidences occurred that ended up with this individual being arrested and being in jail. So I think as some of the topics that we talk about with our interview today, where we talk about things that we can all agree on, things that we believe should be the case, things that we think that the government should be doing, that we can all agree on, making sure that people are not having to rely on the county jail for their mental health is one of the things that I think everybody can agree is not where we should be, ending up.
Yeah, and this goes that, Bill Wayborn's on immigration task force, he's on integrity
Elections.
task force, and these two political shenanigans, if he was taking his energy from those, would he have saved one life? Would there be one life saved because of the prioritization? He should be sleeping, dreaming about this situation and nothing else. And if anyone sees him walking around Tarrant County talking about something outside of this, he needs to be held accountable because, I've been to different restaurants in Arlington, and not lying to you, there's a bulletin board saying, learn how to shoot guns with Bill Wayborn, and learn how to manage in safety. And it's a $50 session to come and hang out with Bill Wayborn. I've seen that in banks in Arlington. I was getting a home loan for our second home. All right. That's where I was like, is this serious? Is this a real thing? And so it's just like, this guy's doing a lot of different things to play politics. If this doesn't activate the Democrats and the progressives or us to care about county, we have to get people to realize this is our chance to really, up until November, to keep this accountable and on top of everybody's radar. All right, so now we're going to move into the big story.
So our guest today is Jim Riddlesperger, who is a professor at TCU. He's also a neighbor and a friend. I count him as a neighbor and a friend, someone I've known for years and someone I have really respected. And so when we started having a lot of guests recently that were kind of in the political realm, we were contemplating who might be able to come on and talk about some of these things. And we suggested that Jim come on, and he graciously accepted our invitation. But he is a professor of political science at Texas Christian University and a native of Denton, Texas. He has taught at TCU since 1982. He has interest in American politics with an emphasis on presidency, Congress, and Texas politics. Jim is a frequent consultant at national, state, and local news media concerning politics and elections, and he speaks at many civic and professional groups each year. I see his name popping up everywhere. When we first were talking to him this morning, I mentioned that he had been a recent guest at a breakfast group that I go to, and he said that his wife has basically told him he is taking on too many things and saying yes to too many things. And I totally understand that, because I have been sharing with my husband that in his retirement, he is doing quite a few too many things. But he's a great resource for our community, and his name pops up often in articles about political decisions that we all are called on to make when we have elections going on. So with that, we are happy to have Jim here and start off with telling us his Fort Worth story.
Well, I came to Fort Worth in 1982, but the truth is I grew up in Denton. So, and Denton was a small town then, unlike what it is now. For that matter, Fort Worth was kind of a small town, but we came to Fort Worth to see the big city lights from Denton and to go to Leonard's department store downtown during the Christmas season. So Fort Worth was always kind of an amazing place for me. It was the bright lights of the big city, Little did I know that Willie Nelson was going to, be down there by Leonard's talking about pretty paper and pretty ribbons while he was perusing the Leonard's windows. But in 1982, TCU offered me a job, and that was my incentive to come to Fort Worth. So I've been here ever since then. I'm just completing my 42nd year at TCU, and this has been a fabulous place for me professionally and for my family. My wife was on the faculty at TCU for about 20 years before she went back to hospice nursing, and my boys were both born here and raised here. So it's been our home now for a long time.
Great. I have a similar small town, big city story. You know, I grew up in a really small town, and Sacramento was the big city that we went to for shopping and all of that kind of stuff. So
yeah, no,
I understand that.
Well,
now there's there's growth between here and Denton. When
right.
you're going up that highway, that's all you see.
You know, when Interstate 35 West opened from Denton to Fort Worth, there was literally nothing between Denton and Fort Worth. And when my wife was pregnant, there was one Texaco station about half the way between Fort Worth and Denton, where we would be desperately getting so she could go take care of her business. You know,
those important stops along the way.
Yeah, those
on
important
road
stops.
trips.
So it was it's a very different place than it was then. And Fort Worth, you know, I can't tell you. You know, we would come down and park and ride the subway to Leonard's, and of course I thought that was the same as kind of a ride at Six Flags or something. So it was a lot of fun.
An amusement park. Wish we had a train that went up and down 35. I wish we had a train.
Well,
that went
I know
up and
you
down
do,
35.
Ann. You ride the train wherever it goes.
I try, even when I'm not going anywhere.
What's that's just so crazy to think like how big Denton is now. And I have people who like want to live in Denton because of the downtown, the restaurant scene. Like,
music.
Yeah. People are about Denton. I mean, I have people like, I used to live there and work at UNT, and now I work somewhere else, and now I'm ready to come back.
I'll brag on UNT. I have 2 degrees from there, and I grew up on that campus. I went to the laboratory school on the North Texas campus. So I was there from 1959 until I got my master's degree in 1977. So I was literally on the North Texas campus that whole time. And, of course, North Texas, one of the things a lot of people in the Metroplex don't know about North Texas is it has one of the top 4 or 5 music schools in the entire country. And it's been that way for a long time. I mean, the music scene was rich in Denton when I was growing up, even though it was a small town. You know, we went to the jazz band concerts, and, you know, it wasn't just the 1 o'clock jazz band. It was the 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So we made whole days out of those kinds of events when I was growing up. So Denton's a great place. North Texas is a wonderful place. Texas Women's University is a fabulous place. You know, Denton is a city that has its own identity.
Yeah, man. 1959, man, that's amazing. Like to be here this whole time.
EJ's quite a bit younger than the two of us.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Well, I would love to like, what is the biggest trends or changes that you've seen from, you know, from living in Denton all that time to, you know, 2024 now? Like, what's the biggest thing for you?
Well, I mean, you know, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex has just exploded. When I used to go on TCU admissions trips to different cities, they would say, well, it's, you know, we're at the front of the West, but it's not like there's sagebrush blowing through Fort Worth. And the truth is, if you got below Interstate 20 when I got here, there was sagebrush blowing across Hewlin Drive when I got here. You know, Fort Worth is almost triple the size it was when I came here. You know, when you live here through it, you don't kind of realize what's going on until you kind of step back and think about how much things have changed. But that's the big thing, the hypergrowth. And, of course, moving from a pre-internet kind of very slow-paced lifestyle to one that is fully connected to the world and is a much more rapid pace has been a huge change. And, of course, at TCU, when I came to TCU, there were 5,500 students at TCU. It's more than doubled in size and is on its way to triple in size in the next 5 years from what it was when I came in 1982. And that's kind of a microcosm, I think, of Fort Worth in general. And of course, we have to point out that when I came here, Austin was a small town. Fort Worth was a small town, kind of. Austin became the coolest place, but now it's Fort Worth that's the coolest place in Fort Worth in Texas. So we have every reason to be excited about being here. It's a great time to be in Fort Worth. And, of course, that leads to the challenges that I guess you all probably want to talk about, which is, you know, how do you manage growth in a positive way? And I think that that's something that is a challenge that we haven't really begun to grapple with yet. The other thing we haven't really grappled with at the national level, and particularly at the state level, is the fact that our demographics in Texas and in Tarrant County are changing dramatically and doing so very rapidly. And it has nothing to do with immigration. It has to do with birth rates and death rates. Old white people like me are dying off in Texas. Our public schools have been majority Hispanic now for a decade. And soon our population will be majority Hispanic. So I've always said, the nature of politics in Texas is going to change pretty dramatically. And it's not really going to be a question of whether it's red or blue, but rather whether it's going to be rojo or azul. We are going to have cultural changes that I don't think people can really fully anticipate. And I think we need to begin to prepare for a life where the diversity of the Texas population is going to be palpable. I mean, we're going to be majority Hispanic. We'll be 2/3 minority. The other major population that's growing, and of course we see it in Tarrant County, is the Asian population in Texas. So Texas is a rapidly diversifying state, and it's diversifying from within. This has to do with families having babies and old people dying. It doesn't have anything to do with in-migration or out-migration from other states or from other nations.
Yeah, I think I'm guilty of mainly seeing what you do, like when you're quoted in the paper and when you are speaking at different things around town, normally around political season. So what is it that that you teach at TCU, and what have you seen in like the response that you get from the students to the programs that you head up there?
Well, I mean, I am an American politics specialist, and so I have always taught introductory classes. A lot of people, when they get to be full professors, like to move out of the introductory classes, but I've always thought that those were the core of what we do and who we are. I insist on teaching a freshman seminar for incoming students every fall, and that's frankly one of my favorite classes because they're young enough that they don't know yet that they don't have to do everything I tell them to do. It's but they also are open-eyed, and so they see the world with a fresh view that I find extraordinarily exciting. I'm really positive and hopeful about the new generation of people. It's popular among people my age to kind of wring their hands and
get off my lawn.
Yeah, and to talk about how you can't get young people to work anymore, and you can't get they don't know anything about having a schedule and so forth. And don't get me wrong, their lifestyles are very different from mine. And of course, I can't make popular culture references anymore in class because I don't listen to the same music they listen to or see the same shows that they see. And so my role has changed dramatically. I went from 42 years ago, more or less being contemporaries with my student, to now they're much closer to the age of my grandchildren. And so that's a real dramatic change. I am a little troubled this year because I think students are not plugged into the political scene this year. I think it's very difficult for them to identify with the people who are the protagonists of our national politics this year, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, who are, 4 times their age. And they don't resonate very well with them, and they don't like their manner of expressing themselves. They don't like the way they define the world's problems. And so far, the reaction in my classes has been mostly to just turn that off. And yet I think that the visions that we see in our politics are quite different between the two political parties. I really, in many ways, decry the polarization that we have that makes us look like our public opinion is distributed like a barbell, where there's nobody in the middle and everybody's on the two ends, when in fact our public opinion shows pretty well, if you get political identification out of it, our public opinion is much more shaped like a football with very few people at the extremes and most of the people in the middle. Americans are not terribly ideological in the way that they deal with their problems. They tend to ask questions like, will this work? Will this fix a problem? They tend to be practical in their orientation rather than ideological. And yet I think that the polarization we see that has started in national politics but has trickled down to state politics, where our state legislature is extraordinarily polarized now, and even to local politics, where our nonpartisan city council often finds itself polarized. That is, I think, a change that that we're going to have to monitor. We've got to get a way to get past it. I mean, politics has to be the art of disagreeing without being disagreeable. And we have to be understanding of people who have different perspectives than we do. I think one of the lessons of the Trump movement in American politics that has been ignored by many people is that there is a level of frustration in the United States that is palpable. And a lot of people want a means of expressing that frustration, and I think Donald Trump has given them that.
Going back to your comments about the changes in demographics in the state, I think many years ago when I was serving on the council, we had a demographer come up from Houston, I think, who was presenting to us kind of that change that was going to happen. And I was sitting at the table with quite a few older white contemporaries on the council who I think were surprised by that. Coming from California, where I was surrounded by a much more diverse population that was kind of mixed together, everywhere you would go in a public place, you would see people of all different races. And then coming back here in Fort Worth, there's so much bubbles, and people kind of stay in their bubbles. And I think that's breaking down a little bit. I think there's more people kind of going throughout Fort Worth. Have you seen that to be the case? Or do you see like the pockets where people stick to the north side or to the east side or to the west side?
Well, Ann, in the first place, you're neither old was your time on the city council many years ago.
Okay,
I just want you to say.
I think I might have been well, some of my colleagues were not as old either. So.
Anyway, I think that there's no choice but that we're going to see a breakdown in those communities. It used to be that neighborhoods tended to be kind of ethnically the same. And, of course, for many years in Texas, that was by law.
That's in the deeds on
sure.
my neighborhood.
When I refused to sign the restrictive deed when I closed my house in 1988 that said that I could not sell my house to anyone of African or Hebrew descent.
Yeah.
I don't know why they left the Latinos out, but apparently that would have been okay. But I said, I'm not signing that. And the people said, well, that's not enforceable. I said, you don't understand. I'm not signing that. And so we had to get an exception, an initial, and so forth. And I think the people who I bought the house from were kind of upset that I had that I would not sign that, but it didn't upset them enough that they didn't let us close on the house. Yeah. Anyway, so we've had that by law. But the other thing is the mobility of our population is incredibly different than it was even a few years ago. And more than that, we live in a world where, if we're talking about young people, I deal with all the time, the categories of ethnicity that were so important for us old baby boomers no longer are important for our students. They do not see nationality. They do not see race. They do not see ethnic identity. They do not see sexual orientation as relevant in their relationships with others. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very hopeful about the ability of the American people to embrace a much more diverse population, and I think we're going to have imaginative leaders who know how to do that rather than to deny that it's actually going on. And you're right; it's been convenient for people who are my age and older. I live in a neighborhood now that is mostly white, not exclusively, but mostly white, and it's easy to kind of go through life, seeing only people like yourself. But I think that's going to be less the case, and I think that the younger people are more accepting of that than we have been, and I think that's a positive sign going forward.
Yeah, I think the city has done some research into the redlining that occurred, and if you look at zoning, it all kind of follows that as well. And so I think that's something I don't know if I'm sure you probably are aware that the city's doing an update to the comprehensive plan that hasn't been done in 30 years. And I've been a little concerned because the meetings that I've seen so far have been predominantly attended by older white folks, and that's the people that vote. And so if those are the only people that are showing up at these meetings, then the voices of those people that you are seeing every day, young kids on your campus, are not being heard in those meetings. And I think it's really important that even if you're apathetic and have, a hard time connecting with the presidential candidates on the ballot, that there are other things that you can get involved in your city that are going to have impact on what your community looks like in the future.
It reminds me, I was at a meeting of some friends actually a few weeks ago, and we were talking about civic education in the United States and the fact that young people don't participate. In many ways, I think the 26th Amendment, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, is kind of one of the most failed social experiments we've had in the United States. A lot of people don't know this, but President Johnson announced his support for that amendment at TCU at the opening of what was then Daniel Meyer Coliseum in 1968. So you can see things happened at TCU. Anyway, the turnout among young voters has always been low. And that is a passion of mine to try to get them to turn out. And so far, it's been relatively unsuccessful. There was better turnout among younger voters in the 2020 election than there had been in previous elections. But our polls so far this year suggest that they have not become plugged into the politics nearly as much this year as they were 4 years ago at this time. And whether that can change over the course of the summer is something that I think we're just going to have to wait and see. But my view is that I think that we need to do everything we can to get people plugged in because, the interests of old people and the interests of young people are not the same. And we have to acknowledge that. And if young people don't vote, then they let old people make their decisions for them. And I don't think they want that. And many of the critical issues that we have in the state of Texas and locally, issues of public education, issues of public transportation, issues having to do with what we want our city to look like in 20 years. You talked about redoing a comprehensive plan every 30 years. Well, that's actually not bad. That's the way that's the rhythm of life, right? But if the prelude is the prediction of the future, it may be 2050 before we readdress the notion of a new comprehensive
plan. It says right on it,
plan,
2050 plan.
and so the result is that it's important for young people to be plugged in now, because by the time we get another comprehensive plan, they'll be old people, and that's one of the real ironies of democracy is that often the people who are most affected by decisions made by the government are people who are least likely to participate. So when I ask people say, well, we need better public education and better civics education, I'm thinking, I'm trying. I've been doing this for 50 years.
I mean, it's the law that they're supposed to be informing 18-year-olds and getting them registered to vote. Like, all the schools are supposed to be doing that. Yeah. And I think I went to Southwest High School when I was running for mayor in 2021. And there were people there trying to get those kids signed up, and they were thrilled to see a candidate in the room as they were, registering to vote. And some of them were like, had never even been introduced to the idea.
And of course, rational candidates don't spend time with young voters because it's a waste of time, because young voters don't turn out. And that's the problem. I mean, right? I mean,
the lists that you get are the people that vote. Those are the doors you knock on. And that drove me insane when I was running. I wanted to knock on every door, and the people who are the, experts would say, that's a waste of your time. You're not going to convince them. And I was just like, but I think you and I struggle with the same.
Obviously. I mean, it's such an obvious disconnect. And yet it's one that I think we have to just deal with.
Yeah. You said your expertise is in American politics. You see a lot in like data, or the Gen Z's the most pessimistic generation of, what's the hope for the future? Can't find purpose. Today, Americans are not as confident in their national government, their justice system, their voting elections. Is this similar to other years that you've seen in the past, or is this what makes this different?
Oh, my goodness, you're just going to tap into a whole lecture here if you're not careful. No, we've been on a steady decline in confidence in institutions in the United States since 1968. Remember, in 68, we were in the middle of the credibility gap in Vietnam. We were about to embark upon the Watergate affair, and we have seen just kind of a steady decline. And it's not just a decline in confidence in government or on the presidency. It's also, we have a Congress with less than 10% approval rating. Our Supreme Court now is down in the low 40s in its approval rating, which has just never been the case. But it's more general than that. People have lost confidence in businesses. They've lost confidence in banks. They've lost confidence in lawyers. They've lost confidence in churches. They've lost confidence in public education. All of those numbers are declining. I think it forces us, and should force us, to think more systematically about how we can transform the compact that the American dream is supposed to give us. I mean, Michael Dukakis was maybe one of the worst candidates that's ever run for the presidency, but he had a wonderful tagline that I think we ought to kind of repeat. You know, our government should insist that every person be a full shareholder in the American dream. I like that terminology. And I don't think that that's a partisan terminology. I think that that is an absolute statement of who we are and what we're about. And we need to redouble our efforts to make sure that no one gets left behind, that no one gets left out, that voices are heard. And we have to embrace things. I mean, we have protests going on college campuses all over the country on the very passionate issue of Israel-Gaza conflict. And without taking a side on that, I mean, we have to be able to allow people to express their very diverse opinions on these things, and to do so in a way, as long as they're careful with their language, that we can understand why the Israeli perspective is different from the Palestinian perspective, and where those folks are coming from, and the fact that much of it, if we get outside of the passion of the moment, has nothing to do with being anti-Semitic or anti-Palestinian or anti-Muslim. It has to do with the fact that we have differing perspectives here. We have to allow people to shout at the top of their lungs what their perspectives are, as long as they can do that in a respectful way. And we need to allow people to violate laws civilly. That's the way change is made in the United States. What we have to do, though, is to make sure that those are done in a peaceful manner. And I think that's what the problem is right now, is that we don't really know how to go about discourse in the United States. And why are young people turned off by this? Well, the answer is they've never witnessed a functional political system. Our political system has been in turmoil their entire lives. My students were all born in this century. The first presidential election in their life was one where George W. Bush won while getting fewer votes than Al Gore. The polarization that kind of is we kind of decry as older folks, is something that for young folks is just a fact of life. The fact that people yell at each other and do so in ways that are quite uncivil and pejorative, where they're perfectly willing to call folks liars and cheaters and racists and a variety of other things. Well, I can tell you, if you call somebody a racist, the conversation is over. Yeah, you cannot have a conversation after you've called someone that kind of a name. And we have to learn to get back to the area where we're actually talking about ideas rather than talking about each other.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that fall into those partisan things that I never thought of as being partisan. I mean, when I was down in Austin doing work for Safe Streets initiatives and would hear from people on the right side of the aisle saying that was like some left agenda, It was shocking to me. I'm here to try to save lives, and it doesn't matter if they're Republicans or Democrats. We're talking about trying to make streets safe for people. And so the things that we put into these buckets of Republican or Democrat, and when there are things that we could come together on, but it's like nobody's willing to do that. I sometimes think about the way Quakers do things with coming to consensus, and Quakers did a lot of protesting, but it was always very, silent protest, civil, like exactly what you're describing. But I don't think there's a lot of people that are understanding of doing things that way anymore. What's
your take on the impact of this on the upcoming election? Because it feels, and people say, it's the left kind of attacking the left, right? If Biden's going to have an event, they're showing up at Biden's event, not Trump's event, even though Trump's more right than Biden. So it almost creates this like infighting of a path forward. You have to pick out of those two options, and we might end up with that option you don't want that's come from this protesting.
The first thing I would say is it's April.
Yeah.
The election's in November, if I've looked right in my calendar. Most rational people have not really engaged the election yet. One of the silly things, this is a whole different conversation. One of the silly things is having our primary in March, well before people are engaged in politics for the year. We had 17% turnout in our primaries this year. That means, if you think about it, step back for a moment while we have polarization, 5% if you assume Democrats and Republicans are about evenly split in the turnout, now we know there were more Republicans than Democrats, but if we just play with those big numbers, 5% of the electorate nominates our Republican candidates and 5% nominates our Democratic candidates. Most Americans are not thinking about politics yet. So I would urge folks in April and May not to pay much attention to the pundits. They're talking about stuff that by definition they don't have any knowledge about. Our polls are not good right now. They are very fungible. We don't, in fact, technically have nominees for president yet. That won't come until midsummer. So kind of making a conjecture about what the election might look like in November, I think, is very difficult right now. I think that one thing that we do know is that we have a very evenly divided population. And so the election is likely to be very close for the presidency. Unfortunately, because of gerrymandering and self-gerrymandering, that's not true of our local elections. Our elections for the state legislature and the state Senate and for U.S. Congress and even for the Senate typically are not terribly competitive now because the districts have been gerrymandered or people have self-gerrymandered. And honestly, the self-gerrymandering is more of an issue than the gerrymandering. We like to talk about gerrymandering, but the truth is that people move into cities when they want diversity and they want arts and they want all of the cultural events, and those people tend to be Democrats. People who want to live a quiet suburban lifestyle and go to church on Sundays, they typically move to the suburbs or the exurbs, and those people tend to vote Republican. So in Texas, we have 38 House elections for the U.S. House of Representatives this year. The Cook Political Report thinks one of them's competitive, and two of them might become competitive. So this notion somehow that we have these elections going on that are really going to make a difference, I think is very, very much a misrepresentation of what's actually going on. And again, because of that and because of the Electoral College, people can do the math. And the truth is, the math says that if we think of our vote as an individual thing that only individuals do, you're wasting your time. The only way that it makes sense to think about voting is to think about it as a collective activity, to think about it as an activity where you are expressing your voice on behalf of yourself and others similarly situated, that we're all in this boat together and we all need to be rowing together in order for the boat to get to where it wants to be. And Safe Streets is a classic example of that. I mean, the truth is everyone's for safe streets. What you're hearing here, of course, is a reaction to political movements like the Black Lives Matter movement and other protest movements that they think, that conservatives think are representative of people who are for safe streets, when in fact they're for safe streets. And so we make partisan issues out of things that are not partisan at all. I remember years ago, I was talking to a former city manager of Fort Worth, and he said, I have discovered in my job that Democrats and Republicans alike both like sewer systems that work.
Shocking.
And all of our government's that way if you think about it. Every bit of it is. We want people who are hungry to be fed, people who don't have health care to have health care, children who are not educated to be educated. We want our streets to be safe. Everyone's for those things. Everyone.
Yeah.
And if we lose sight of that, then it's easy for us to divide ourselves into silly camps. In order to really govern, you have to just understand that our goals are actually quite similar to one another's. In most areas, there are some areas that are intractable, but in most areas, our goals are actually quite similar. And so we need to kind of reformulate the way we talk about these issues.
Or be able to just talk about it. Because I think a lot of times people divide into those camps and then they refuse to even talk about it. And I have friends that I worry about bringing up topics with because I feel like they're going to go straight into those extreme positions and not be willing to talk about things.
Well, and of course, talking about it's one thing. The other thing is, though, and this is something that I think we really need to emphasize here, is talking's only half of it. The other half is listening. And listening is something we don't do well. Yeah. If we don't listen to the messages of people who are frustrated and upset in our society, if we don't listen to them with a full ear, we cannot possibly do anything to address their concerns. And we are all guilty of wanting to talk over one another, when in fact we ought to fold our arms and listen to them more.
Yeah, I think that to your point about when you call somebody a name or you approach somebody in a really aggressive manner and then they shut down and don't listen to you, I witnessed that multiple times on city council. People coming and they're passionate about the concern and the problem that they face in their life, but they come in with an aggressive or very accusatory attitude. And I would watch my colleagues shut down or even vocalize, I'm not going to do what this person is asking me to do because of the way that they have come at me. And, people came at me too with things that they were upset that they thought I wasn't doing to the degree that they wanted it. People who probably I was very aligned with. But I worked really hard to make sure that I wasn't put off by whatever the demeanor was or the way they were doing it. But I think that's all.
And that's so very difficult because our egos are so wrapped up in our description of self. And all of us think that our positions are reasoned. That all of our and that our positions are well considered, and that's probably true, but we can also all learn. And the moment that we quit trying to learn what these frustrations are, and often the frustrations are expressed in ways that really belie what the real issue is. There are a lot of people who feel like the American system is not working for them economically. Well, maybe it's because it isn't. Our data show that we're getting more and more concentration of wealth and fewer people, and more people who are workaday people are having difficulty making ends meet. Well, those are some issues that we need to address. And again, I don't think anybody's opposed to fixing those, but we have to really, as Ross Perot used to say, we got to get under the hood and fix it. And the way you fix it is not as apparent as identifying what the problems are. When people talk about public schools and what's going on in public schools, it's because their most precious things are in those public schools. They're children. And they're passionate about having a safe, supportive environment for their children to learn the basic skills. And to the degree that we can create a safe environment for people, regardless of their ideology, regardless of their religion, regardless of their background, we have to do that. Otherwise, our public school system is going to be leaving people out. And so these are not easy questions to answer, but they're questions that we just really need to begin to address.
Yeah, you brought up two parts, but I think that whole like a lot of times I feel like people don't bring up the dynamics of capitalism and being a capitalistic state and the compound interests of, if there's 83 million boomers that have 17% of the world's GDP in their banks. Once they go, they're showing that the new divide is actually, if you look at the top 10% of millennials, they're actually doing better than the boomers at their age, where the average millennial is not. But that 10%, if you're in that top 10%, the average amount of money your parents gave you to get a house was like around $140,000 or something crazy. And so like you're having this trickling down of money to this next class. And I think this is a big narrative of that's going to really impact politics is when, like, what do we do? Like, what's your interpretation of like the system of capitalism and how people feel like it's not there for them and it then creates politics? Polarization.
Okay, well, I'm glad you asked a small question. Look, I don't think anyone really wants to live in a pure capitalism.
Yeah.
I mean, if the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century taught us anything, it's that we have to have regulated capitalism. Now, there are real debates to be had about how regulated it should be. But at the same time, we also need to be aware that the government rewards certain kinds of activities and does not reward others. Business people, for example, get to write off a lot of expenses that working people don't get to write off. We give huge tax breaks to people who buy houses and none to people who can't afford to buy houses. These are all decisions that our society has made over time, and they, of course, mitigate a real capitalism. And what, in fact, they do is they set up a system that those who have benefit and those who have not do not. And that's not fair either. So the question is, how are we going to have a capitalistic system, which we are going to have? Again, even liberals in the United States are capitalists, despite the fact that the pejorative socialist is often tossed their direction. But there are questions about how you go about regulating things, and questions about who should pay and under what circumstances. The truth is, our tax system in the United States is very flat. And in Texas particularly, poor people pay much higher rates of taxation than wealthy people do, even though some of our narratives in the United States suggest that it's the rich people who are getting soaked by our tax system, when in fact the wealthiest quintile of Americans pay about the same rate overall as the third quintile and the first quintile, and that there are huge tax breaks for the top 1%. And of course, the top 1% makes a high percentage, maybe up to a third of all the money made in the United States is made by 1% of our population. And so I think that there are a bunch of really difficult questions here. And it's entirely too simplistic to say, is this a problem of capitalism? The answer is yes, it's a problem of capitalism, but we live in a capitalistic system, and we will. I always, when this question is asked to me, I always ask people, what was Adam Smith's most popular book when he was alive? And they all answer, of course, The Wealth of Nations, which is the Bible of capitalism. And the answer, of course, is not that. The answer is his book entitled The Moral Sentiments, in which he argued that the excesses of capitalism always have to be mitigated by personal values and consideration of others. And that is something that capitalism will always have to wrestle with. And I think the degree to which we wrestle with that in a conscientious way determines how fair the system is.
Yeah. What when you look at it then, though, also pull it now globally, I guess, in the sense of like the dynamic of countries getting richer or more powerful, their people becoming more literate. Where do you see, America rocked for a while, but now when you look at wealth, when you look at who's really benefiting from the higher education system, you talk about the booming of Asian people, half of Indian Asians have a math science degree of some types. 60 of the Fortune 500 CEOs are Indian Asian, a lot of the global order that gets to benefit in America. How do you see America navigating globalism in a time where we can't maybe afford, or people are saying we can't afford to be the operating system person that we once were, and now you have a lot of things going on that maybe makes that hard, as you have Ukraine, you have the Middle East, China, Russia. How do you navigate this here?
Well, I mean, we live in a world of instantaneous communication globally. And anybody who thinks that we have an American economy that is somehow isolated from the rest of the world is living in a dream world. The truth is that the United States still has the largest economy in the world. It may for several more years, because Chinese growth has kind of lessened a little bit over the last several years. The largest population country in the world is India now, no longer China, the world is evolving in a way that is very dynamic. Europe is no longer the dominant continent in the world. Asia is. The global South is growing as well. I think we have to obviously embrace the changes going on in South America and in Australia, and more importantly in sub-Saharan Africa, that are going to transform the world in ways that I think none of us can kind of foresee. but we have to be aware of it. And that doesn't mean that we have to give up on the American dream. The American dream is still very, very much alive. But it does mean that we have to be aware that that dream is going to be much more international in its focus than it is now, by definition, in a world that is just getting smaller and smaller all the time. There are a number of other things that we're going to have to confront. I mean, all of our demographic trends suggest that the population growth in the world will probably cap in about 15 or 20 years, and the world population might become declining at that point. Well, obviously, capitalism doesn't thrive as we have defined capitalism up until now in a world that is getting smaller rather than bigger. So there are lots and lots of things out there that I think we're going to have to be attuned to, and I cannot tell you that I have any insight as to how that's going to be transformed, but I do know that it will. And again,
and it seems like the conversation people are just not having because of all the extreme conversations. It feels like I think the disappointing part, it's like no one's talking about the things that are really important because we're worried about the things to the left and to the right.
That's global as well. I mean, one of the characteristics of Modi in India is he's a nativist, and he wants pure Indian population. Xi in China is all about reuniting China, including Taiwan, for nationalist reasons. Putin's about reuniting the Soviet Union. That's his goal. And going back to the way things were, we see in even the progressive countries in Europe, we see nativist and nationalist and far right leaders taking over in those countries. So this is not unique to the United States. This is something where the entire world is grappling with change that is happening more rapidly than they can process it, and they are very concerned and worried that the things that were of value to them when they were growing up are now going away. That's probably something that is inherent in the human being, that we are most comfortable with the things that we're familiar with. But that familiarity is not going to last going forward nearly to the degree that it has in the past.
Yeah, I think your comment about things growth, we rely on growth and things growing, and that's what's going to pay for things. I think locally, bringing it back to kind of Fort Worth, that's something that we have done where we've relied on just growth, which has been kind of sprawl, and now we're trying to maintain the things that exist, all the roads and all the things that exist. And growth doesn't really pay for growth when you do it in that sprawly manner.
And that's exactly right. We also, I mean, there's another thing that all people agree on. Everyone wants clean water and clean air. Well, the growth that we have done in Texas has largely happened without respect to what the consequences of that are for the air we breathe.
Yeah.
And Dallas-Fort Worth, obviously, is an area that leads the nation.
Non-attainment and air quality.
In problems with air quality because we haven't done the kind of planning necessary to give us public transportation, access through bike lanes and walking lanes and so forth, neighborhood planning where you have grocery stores in every neighborhood, for example, rather than having to drive.
Like where we live.
Yeah.
We definitely have an abundance of grocery stores.
And there are neighborhoods where you have to go 10 miles to get to a grocery store. And those kinds of practical considerations, I think, are things that that forward-looking cities are going to have to grapple with over time because it is simply not sustainable to rely upon gasoline-powered engines moving forward. Now, are we going to have all electric cars in the next 20 years? Are we going to have nuclear fission, as a technology to provide unlimited power without pollution? We don't know the answer to those questions, and certainly they could transform things in ways that, again, we can't foresee. But in the meantime, I think we have to deal with the problems that we have as well, and to start thinking in terms of planning for ways to make sure that our environment is there for future generations as well.
Yeah, I think it's short-sighted to make those decisions based on like a political cycle, because folks that are elected to office are looking for wins in the short term. And so if you make those long-range plans that are not going to come to fruition while they're in office or while they're running for office, they tend to be like not so concerned about them.
What is your I mean, what is your, like, I guess, opinion on the evolution of suburban sprawl in Texas? Like, and how now there's a Denton, but now I met someone who said they live in Midlothian and they were working in Fort Worth. Like, it just continues to go. What's kind of your take on that being the new Texas communities and how it's going to be?
There's no question that the story of the last 25 to 30 years has been one of massive growth in Texas. And that massive growth, I think, has benefited us in ways that really were even beyond our dreams in some ways 25 and 30 years ago. But I think it's wrong-headed to think that growth is going to continue forever. It simply will not. We don't have the infrastructure for it. For goodness sakes, we hadn't even talked about water supply. We don't have the water supply for it. I love praising the Texas congressional delegation for giving us all the lakes that we have in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that allows a population double what it was when those lakes were built to have plenty of drinking water. But the truth is, they did that because they wanted to make the Trinity River into a canal down to Houston, which was a pipe dream that probably could never be realized. But that was the thinking, right? And so it was kind of an accidental planning that is there. But we live in an area that simply will not continue to get the level of water that we have as we have global warming, and we know this. This is not something that we have to make up. So again, I think that one of the disconnects, and you talked about it. We live in a democratic system. And we all know that when we do planning, if we're doing careful planning, if you're planning, your family finances, you do that over a 5-year, or 10-year, or 15-year, or for retirement planning, your whole career, right? In order to have the money that you would like to have in order to retire. But in a democracy, our planning lasts till the next election. And that's always the case. And so the incentives of elected officials are always different from the incentives for effective planning in a democracy. And it's one of the glories of democracy, of course, is that we can change course through elections. But one of the negatives of democracy is that long-range planning and staying the course in terms of what we're trying to accomplish is something that is very difficult to do.
Yeah, it can suffer for sure.
Yeah, we didn't talk too much about state politics or the landscape there. You kind of touched it a little bit, but when you're speaking or people are asking you about that, what's your comments on where we are today?
Well, again, I think that it's a mistake to think of Texas as a uniformly conservative state. It is a conservative state. It always has been a conservative state, probably will continue to be that way. But I've always said that there are at least 5 Texases. I'll get to the 5th and most important one in a minute. But the deep East Texas is very much deep South. East Texas has a political culture that is very much like that of Arkansas and Louisiana, which are the adjacent states to East Texas. And that's going to be the case, and they vote overwhelmingly Republican. West Texas has 2 kinds of conservatives. They have the agricultural conservatives of the Panhandle area that are much more like Oklahoma and Kansas in terms of their orientation. And then there's the oil conservatives of the Midland-Odessa area that have a different kind of conservatism. And then, of course, we have the Valley that is very dominant by Latino populations and tends to be liberal, although not evenly so. Because of the, very, very diverse population that we kind of like to corral under the term
and lump together.
Yeah, Latino, and in fact, they are really much more diverse than that. And then, of course, there's the triangle, the Texas Triangle, the I-35, I-45 corridor, where you have 5 of the largest cities in the United States, 5 of the 12 largest cities in the United States. Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. And over 70% of the Texas population lives in those areas. And while there are some conservative areas within that triangle, that part of Texas is not stereotypically Texan. It's urban, it's diverse, it's modern. Folks don't ride horses to work, and no one does. But it's a very different kind of population, and it also is politically competitive. Of course, the cities are all liberal in terms of their voting. They're very bright blue spots in the state of Texas. And so I think that effective governing in Texas is going to have to get away from this polarization that has characterized what we're doing. We need to get beyond that, and we need to actually
Speak to each other.
Is this a theme today?
Yeah,
we have to talk and we have to listen. And if we can't do that, I think Texas is going to have a very difficult time meeting the challenges moving forward.
Yeah, but like Bud said, Democrats are becoming a third party influence. Like, he really dogged them out. And so and that's what I guess that's what it feels like when you had someone like Beto who got crushed. Yeah, it feels hopeless as a Democrat.
And Bud is a very dear friend of mine, and obviously a very, very good observer of Texas politics. We're almost exactly the same age. I shouldn't admit that, should I? But I think that we need to take a longer view than that. The dynamics of politics change. And what we think is true today will not be true tomorrow. That is just a reality of politics. And so I can tell you that Texas will look very different in a decade than it does today. And that's the reason that I think you have to do it. Yes, the Democratic Party has not won a statewide election since 1994. That is just a reality. That's getting to be 30 years, if I count correctly, a third of a century since the Democrats have been able to do that. And he's very right, because in the sense that means that there are very few Democrats with statewide name recognition. There's a very short bench in terms of people who could be competitive. It is the case that Beto O'Rourke got routed. But that was his third election in Texas, right? He very nearly won the first one when he ran against Ted Cruz. He then ran for the presidency, which was a premature and failed bid. And then he ran for governor. And that third race was Beto 2.0, not Beto 1.0. And people were tired of his unsuccessful candidacies at that point, and so he didn't fare as well as he might have. But why did he run? Well, the truth was there was no other Democrat that could run statewide, that had statewide recognition. And, of course, that's, I think, the challenge of Colin Allred right now as well. I mean, he's running against Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is, by all kind of objective measures, a vulnerable candidate, albeit a vulnerable candidate in a Republican-leaning state. Remember that Donald Trump only won Texas by less than 6%, 5.5%. In the 2020 election. So if all the tumblers fell in place, you could theoretically elect a Democrat statewide in Texas. Is that going to happen? Well, the challenge is real, because Colin Allred is only known in the Dallas-Fort Worth area because that's where he's run for Congress. And Texas is, if you haven't noticed, a very large state.
Yeah.
And getting name recognition is a huge problem and extraordinarily expensive. And the other thing that Bud may have been part of what Bud was talking is the national Democrats are not terribly supportive of Texas Democrats, because Texas Democrats have been the bank for the national party. The way that the party has been competitive across the country is by going and getting big checks from Texas Democrats to spend in other parts of the country, because they feel like they are much more likely to win an election in Montana and in Ohio and in North Carolina than they are in Texas, and for much less money. And so until that perception changes, it's going to be very difficult for Democrats to run statewide in Texas.
Yeah, I love that. And then, so kind of, I know we got running into time. I have two more questions. I don't know what you have.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess let's go into Tarrant County and Fort Worth. You said the world's getting smaller. Where does Fort Worth, Tarrant County play in its responsibility in the world. We have Alliance, Texas, and manufacturing. We have the logistics from Canada to Mexico. We're in the middle of the country. We're a big county that's a purple county. So going all the way to us, what kind of influence do we have in Texas, in the country, and maybe even how in the world?
Yeah, I mean, Tarrant County is the epicenter of Texas politics. It's on obviously it's on the NAFTA highway, we used to call it. Now, of course, we don't call it NAFTA anymore, but we're on the highway that has more trade coming through Fort Worth from Mexico than any other city in the country, in many ways. And Mexico is the United States' largest trading partner. We haven't talked about Mexico. We've talked about China and India, but our biggest trade partner is Mexico. And hardly surprising, since
it's right there.
And 2/3 of the border between the United States and Mexico is in Texas. And Fort Worth is right in the epicenter of that. You're right. DFW is one of the 3 or 4 most important hubs in terms of commerce in the country. And Fort Worth is the competitive Tarrant County. Fort Worth is quite blue, but Tarrant County is actually very, very purple. Tarrant County is a swing county in the state of Texas, there's one of the reasons that Democrats have been quite optimistic about Texas going forward is that twice in the last 3 elections, Tarrant County has gone for a Democratic candidate. They went for Beto O'Rourke over Ted Cruz narrowly, and for Joe Biden over Donald Trump narrowly. So Tarrant County Democrats have reason to kind of be optimistic, although that has not shown up in election results yet. But it shows what is possible if the tumblers all get in the right place for Democrats. But Tarrant County remains a Republican county, and fairly comfortably Republican. And until the Democrats have some success, I think it will remain that way. I think Tarrant County needs to, and Fort Worth, need to kind of relabel who they are. I guess I'm probably one of 6,000 people in Fort Worth when I land at DFW Airport on the west runways, which are in Tarrant County, only to have a flight attendant say, "Welcome to Dallas."
I know. Irks me too.
And we need to start acting like and telling our story that we're the 12th largest city in the United States, even if that little city to our east didn't exist. Okay.
What is your so that was my last question, was around the culture of Fort Worth and Stockyards, Cowtown, that becoming politicized as well over the years. I guess what's your view on, that culture dynamic in Fort Worth?
I love the Western culture of Fort Worth. Absolutely adore it. I think it's one of the most charming things about our city. And it reflects, obviously, the West Texas heritage that Fort Worth represented. When Amon Carter was in charge of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, when TCU was winning national championships in football back in the 1930s, we were the University of West Texas, and Fort Worth was the city of West Texas, and the Star-Telegram was the newspaper of West Texas. And so there is a long heritage of Fort Worth being kind of the most western of the cities. And I think that that's a distinctive characteristic that we not only ought to celebrate, but we ought to embrace. Having said that, it also is the case that, the West was not an area of just the Wild West. It was the area of families. It was the area of growth. It was an area of accepting differences. There's a thesis about Western growth that people moved here as a safety valve to let off steam. People that didn't fit in elsewhere came to the West because they could be accepted here for having their differences. And I think that that's another aspect of the West that we need to that we need to embrace. We need to embrace that the land is what makes us. I mean, if there's anything that farmers and ranchers understood, it was that the land and the environment and water and air was critical to their success. And so they were early day environmentalists. And we have to acknowledge that, or we're going to miss what was really special about some elements of Western culture.
Yeah, it's funny because like you named the 5 Texases, and you talked about how Fort Worth is the West Texas, yet we're also supposed to be a part of the Texas Triangle, which is almost like this different thesis and political aura than the West Texas history that we needed. Like we're kind of Fort Worth's 2 feet in of are we in the West Texas crew, or are we the Texas Triangle?
We're firmly in the triangle.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can't be where the West begins.
And that's where we are. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for being on the pod and giving us a full hour of your time. I felt like we learned a ton. I learned a ton. I could have kept going.
Yeah.
I'm delighted
really
to be here.
appreciate
It's been fun.
It's been great.
And there we have it, people. That was Jim Riddlesperger. What an exciting interview. He was just dynamite.
Yeah, he makes me want to go back to college.
Yeah,
I think
100%.
that there's so much information that I think just right on the top of his head, at the tip of his tongue, he could answer questions without having to go look things up, which I find to be really impressive. I feel like I should go back to school. A lot of stuff has fallen out of my brain since I was in school.
And a lot of my questions is just like when we get someone like Bud or Elisa Simmons or Jim, it's just like I want to ask like the biggest, hardest question, so then you can just see them dice it up, and it's just like it's almost like watching hibachi cook in front of you. Like they're just like, well, technically, and I'm just like that just gives me so much life to just hear them just go for 7 minutes on a very complex question.
Yeah, and I think that some of the questions, bringing it back to local things, it's interesting to hear his take and his optimism and positivity. I was really happy to hear too, because I think a lot of times when we talk about growth in Texas and growth in Fort Worth, people are complaining about the changes that it brings. And I think that this was a much more optimistic look at changes that are happening and the ways that they can be positive and for the benefit of all of us that live here.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and move into wins and losses. And, to kind of start with a loss for all of you, we will not be having a pod next week. And Jim was kind of our last rally of all these interviews for a while. And so I just want you guys to know, like, one, we're going to have a break, but then we're going to be able to jump back in with me and Ann for a little bit. We have some interviews, but we have a lot of just excitement to be able to come back together and really share our own narrative and POVs from all that we've learned from the interviews.
Right. And also, I think that you say it's a loss that we're not going to be on next week, but I've run into so many people who are behind in catching up with listening to the pod that we feel like this is a gift to you.
Yes.
We're going to give you an extra week to get caught up.
Yes.
And then to share with all of your friends that what you benefit from listening to the pod, and hopefully we'll add some viewers over the next week, or listeners over the next week, even though we are taking a break.
Yeah.
Not having a pod next week.
Because these interview ones are like an hour 40. So, it is like 2 episodes in one anyway.
There you go.
So let's go ahead and dive into wins and losses. And we start with our losses.
So my loss is that Autobahn, it's a win and a loss. So I'm going to have to kind of combine them. But Autobahn is looking at Benbrook for a potential car dealership location. And their plans at Clear Fork, which they originally had a tax incentive to go to, are on hold apparently. So the reason I see it as a loss is if a auto sales company moves out of Fort Worth, that means that the tax dollars collected on the sales of a big ticket item like cars are not going to be coming to the Fort Worth coffers. And I see that as the loss. Did I think that having car dealerships in the second phase of Clear Fork was the best from a planning perspective? That wasn't really my go-to of what I was thinking would be the best location. And I think that some of those tax incentives were based around parking garages again, which is always a loss for me. So I think that it's a win that maybe the second phase of Clear Fork will be something different than auto dealerships. But the loss, if they do end up going out of the city of Fort Worth, would be the loss of those tax dollars.
Yeah. A gift and a curse. So my loss is, I feel like lately I've been doing losses selfishly, but my loss is Dallas Wings to leave Arlington, bringing the WNBA games to Dallas. The Dallas City Council has unanimously approved the WNBA team to play in the Kay Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center, Dallas Memorial Auditorium, starting the 2026 WNBA season. Me and my wife would go regularly to the WNBA games because they're close to the east side, so we can go drive there and be back in our house. We could leave at 6:30, be back home at 9:30, and watch the whole basketball game. And the Dallas Wings are awesome, and I recommend everyone to go watch a WNBA basketball game. They're a phenomenal team. Really excited to support them this year. But this just shows you how the Dallas, Frisco, Plano wins in luxury, because Fort Worth now loses the access to the Dallas Wings when their founding stadium was in Arlington. They started the franchise in Arlington, but now because they're getting bigger and people want them closer to Dallas so that Collin County people can make the trip, this is a continued loss where, I'm not saying that gymnastics or lacrosse or the things that we get in Fort Worth aren't important, but we seem to always lose the things that are the economically really impact. These Dallas Wings have already sold out on their season tickets. They're skyrocketing in ticket price. I'm going to a preseason game with Caitlin Clark, and I paid more for that one season ticket than I paid for like 2 tickets last year. And that's not even a real game. So we're losing out on this economic viability from the Dallas Wings. We weren't being proactive enough. I don't know why Dickies Arena could have been an option. There's just a lot of things that I think we missed here. And it's unfortunate because now that's another thing Fort Worth will have to drive an hour to get to. The same way on Tuesday, I'm going to see one of my favorite artists. I'm going to drive an hour on a Tuesday after work to go see someone play in House of Blues in Dallas. And so these are the things that Fort Worth continue to do in order to get cool experiences.
So maybe if we get that high-speed rail between Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston, that'll take care of that, and you won't have to drive to any of these things.
Exactly. What is your... Oh, you did your win. So my win is that, going to Fort Worth. Fort Worth was recently, Bob Francis kind of did an article about best large city for starting a business. Fort Worth moves up to number 7. Fort Worth ranked a lucky number 7 in the last study from Wallet Hub on the best large city to start a business. Fort Worth topped all Texas cities, edging out Austin, Arlington, Dallas. Fort Worth was number 9 last year. The list of number 1 was Orlando, Tampa, Charlotte, Jacksonville, Miami, Atlanta, Fort Worth. I think it's great that Fort Worth is up there. Fort Worth is an affordable city. Fort Worth has a lot of good pro-business laws. But in a way that, when I look at this list, I wonder what the 19 key indicators were. A lot of it was around startup viability, but also looking at the other 10 cities. A lot of these are more conservative cities that also have very pro-business laws and a little bit affordable. I don't know, not necessarily that means that's viable for business if you don't have the people. But the fact that Fort Worth is in a top 10 of a list, I will give it to us, and that we're better than everyone else in that capacity. That's cool. But my win is that Fort Worth is in the conversation. All right, beautiful people. Like we said, we are going to be out next week. We have a lot of travel on our own end for other things, but we give you a ton of cool guests for the last month and a half. And we also feel like we have some really exciting guests coming up as we get to the May 28th election, as we get to November. There's just a lot cooking for this podcast, and it's just been great to see how big the community is growing and the people who listen to the pod.
Yep. I'm going to a conference in Houston to talk about pedestrian safety and Vision Zero, so I'll come back full of information and knowledge to share with y'all about
Maybe
those
that's
activities.
the pod. You just carry a microphone on and just, you just walk around the whole time. And
walk around recording people.
But, so everyone enjoy, and thank you for listening to the podcast.